The air in the grand ballroom of the Finch Tower was an artifact, meticulously curated and cryogenically cold. It was scrubbed of the city's chaotic symphony of scents, exhaust fumes, roasting nuts, human perspiration, and replaced with a sterile, almost imperceptible fragrance of white orchids and liquid wealth. This was not a room for breathing. It was a chamber for performance. Towering walls of laminated glass presented a conquered Manhattan as a glittering tapestry below, a silent testament to the man who owned the sky. Conversations were conducted in hushed, strategic murmurs, the currency of secrets and favors exchanged beneath the crystalline glare of chandeliers that dripped light like frozen tears. On the central dais, a stark platform of black marble, stood Alistair Finch. He was less a man and more a monument to a ruthless ideology. His form was encased in a bespoke Brioni suit so dark it seemed to consume the light around it, a sliver of a black hole in the room's calculated brilliance. His silver hair was sculpted with architectural precision, and his face, a mask of aristocratic boredom, was dominated by eyes the color of a winter sea just before a storm. When he smiled, it was a rare and unsettling event, a flash of polished steel that never reached those glacial eyes. It was a tool, a weapon he deployed with the calculated precision of a drone strike. His gaze, a physical weight, swept across the assembled congregation of New York's power brokers, hedge fund titans, and political scions. He saw them not as peers, but as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet only he could read. His eyes drifted past the taut, surgically enhanced faces and the constellations of diamonds at their throats, skimming over them with a predator's disinterest in its own well-fed pack. His focus drifted, deliberately, inexorably, towards the periphery, the invisible boundary where the gilded world ended and the service world began. There, lining the far wall like ghosts at a feast, stood the catering staff. Among them was Eleanor Washington. At 62, Eleanor moved with a grace born from a lifetime of managing fatigue. Her hands, gnarled by the persistent complaint of arthritis, were her history written in flesh, decades of hoisting trays, polishing silver, and tending to the needs of the oblivious. Yet they moved with a dancer's economy, arranging champagne flutes into a perfect, glittering phalanx. There was a quiet, unyielding dignity in her posture, a spine that had refused to bend completely, despite the immense pressure exerted upon it for years. Beside her, a point of still, defiant energy in the room's restless ecosystem, was her daughter, Maya. Maya was not staff. She was a silent sentry, waiting to drive her mother home, a duty she performed with religious devotion. At 28, she was an anomaly in this environment. Dressed in simple dark jeans and a modest blouse, she was a verse of plain-spoken prose in an anthology of overwrought poetry. Her quietness was often mistaken for timidity, but it was the deep, observant silence of an analyst. Her mind, a place of refuge and power, was a vast, intricate library, skilled at finding the single, dissonant note in a symphony of chaos. This was a talent she had honed not in a prestigious MBA program, but in the hushed, climate-controlled sanctum of the New York Public Library's digital archives, where she coaxed stories from silent, forgotten data streams. Finch's gaze locked onto Eleanor, and then, with a flicker of what could only be described as inspired cruelty, it shifted to Maya. He registered the daughter's protective stance, the subtle jut of her chin, the intelligence burning like a low flame in her dark eyes. The juxtaposition was irresistible. It was a tableau of social Darwinism, a perfect, living diorama for the lesson he was about to impart. He raised a hand, silencing the ambient chatter. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a silken purr that slithered from the speakers, intimate and immense at the same time. Generosity, he began, the word echoing in the cavernous space, is a concept the weak have weaponized to guilt the strong. True generosity, true power, is the art of giving what you can afford to lose, to those who cannot even afford to dream of it. His eyes pinned Eleanor and Maya to the wall. Tonight, we celebrate the launch of the Finch Foundation's Global Literacy Endowment, a noble, if somewhat abstract, cause, a theatrical pause. But I find myself in the mood for something more tangible, a demonstration of potential, a meritocratic experiment. He extended a single, manicured finger, a royal summons that sent a palpable shockwave through the room. You, there, the waitress, and your daughter. Please, come. Join me on stage. A collective intake of breath, sharp and unified, hissed through the ballroom. It was the sound of 100 socialites smelling blood in the water. This was unscheduled, a breach of the evening's carefully orchestrated decorum. This was theater. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over a glass, her face paling. The feeling of 1,000 eyes on her was a physical violation. Maya's hand was instantly on her mother's arm, a warm, steady anchor. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered, her voice a low frequency of reassurance meant only for her. "We'll go up. We will smile. We will be props in his little play, and then we will go home." It was a promise, a shield woven from words. Their walk to the stage was a journey across a social abyss. The clicking of Maya's sensible, worn-soled boots on the gleaming marble sounded like a desecration. Her mother's simple black uniform, designed for invisibility, seemed to shrink under the glare of the spotlights, while Finch's suit shimmered, drinking in the light and reflecting back only darkness. Finch met them at the top of the steps, his cologne an aggressive chemical cloud of sandalwood and self-regard. He bypassed Maya, addressing Eleanor directly, his voice a stage whisper that the microphone amplified into a public proclamation. "And what is your name, my dear?" "Eleanor Washington, sir." Her voice was a fragile thing, a dry leaf skittering across pavement, shaped by a lifetime of trying to take up as little space as possible. "Eleanor," Finch repeated, tasting the name. "And this bright young spark?" he asked, finally turning his predatory attention to Maya. "I'm her daughter," Maya stated, her tone flat and uninviting. She would not offer up her name to be another piece in his game. A genuine flicker of amusement crossed Finch's face. He savored defiance in the powerless. It was the spice that made the eventual crushing so piquant. He gestured grandly towards a sleek, monolithic black box that had been sitting inert on the stage. It was a minimalist sculpture of obsidian glass and brushed steel, featureless save for a single dark screen. "This," he announced, his voice booming with the pride of a mad scientist revealing his creation, "is the Daedalus box." a cognitive labyrinth of my own design. It does not test what you've learned. It tests what you are. It measures raw processing power, memory, logic, pattern recognition, and most importantly, psychological fortitude under extreme pressure. It is, to put it plainly, an unwinnable game for the common mind. He began to circle them, his movements fluid and menacing. I am a profound believer in merit. The cream must be allowed to rise, no matter where it is found. So I make you, young lady, an offer, a test, a chance to prove that brilliance is not the exclusive domain of the privileged. He stopped directly in front of Maya, forcing her to meet his gaze. The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy, and thick with anticipation. "Beat the Daedalus box," he declared, his voice dropping to a dramatic hush. "And my foundation will not offer you a scholarship or a grant. We will provide a personal endowment. Tonight, a single wire transfer for $100 million. The number detonated in the silent room. $100 million. It was an impossible, obscene figure, a number so vast it became an abstraction. It was a mad, glorious, quintessentially Finch gesture, breathtakingly cruel, masquerading as breathtaking generosity. He was dangling a new universe in front of them, a life free from worry, from exhaustion, from invisibility, all with the serene, absolute certainty that he was about to snatch it away, to demonstrate for all to see that the gap between their worlds was not one of circumstance, but of fundamental essence. He was not offering hope. He was meticulously manufacturing a public execution of it. $100 million if you win, the billionaire CEO smirked, the expression of flawless crystallization of his worldview. He held out his hand, not to shake, but to gesture imperiously to the single leather chair bolted before the machine. "What do you say, Miss Washington's daughter?" Maya looked away from him, toward her mother. She saw it all in Eleanor's eyes, a lifetime of slights, of being overlooked, of being ground down by a system that was designed to do exactly that. She saw the fresh humiliation of this moment, of being used as a prop, a symbol of the downtrodden for the amusement of the elite. And then she looked back at Alistair Finch. She looked at the unshakable, reptilian certainty in his eyes, the casual arrogance of a man who had never been told no, who had never faced a consequence, who believed the world was nothing more than a complex machine, and he was its sole engineer. In that fraction of a second, something within Maya shifted. A quiet, academic curiosity hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. This was no longer about money. It was about that smirk. It was about the entire world that smirk represented. "I accept," Maya said. Her voice did not tremble. It rang out with a bell-like clarity that cut through the thick, expectant air, surprising the guests, surprising Finch, and most of all, surprising herself. The smirk on Finch's face faltered, a barely perceptible glitch in his programming. He had expected tears, a stammered refusal, or a reluctant, terrified acceptance. This cool, calm defiance was intriguing. The mouse had not only taken the bait, it had looked the eagle in the eye as it did so. It would make the game all the more satisfying. As Maya moved to the chair, a sense of unreality washing over her, her mother stepped back, her face a storm of fear, and a strange, flickering pride. Before Eleanor retreated into the shadows at the edge of the stage, she pressed something small, cool, and familiar into Maya's palm. It was her own keychain, a cheap plastic trinket from a long-ago trip to a museum, shaped like a miniature worn book. Embossed on its plastic cover were the faded words, "The truth will set you free." Eleanor leaned in, her whisper so faint it was more a breath than a sound. "Your father. He would have wanted you to fight." Always, Maya's fingers closed around the keychain. Its cheap, familiar plastic was a grounding object, a piece of her real world in this sterile, alien landscape. It was an anchor. As she sat, the chair's cold leather seemed to grip her. The screen of the Daedalus box flared to life, its dark glass reflecting her own determined face. The game was about to begin. Alistair Finch was confident he was about to teach a brutal lesson in social hierarchy. He had absolutely no idea that his own education was just beginning. The Daedalus box did not hum or whir. It was utterly silent, its power a menacing presence rather than a sound. The first challenge materialized on the screen without preamble. It was a test of eidetic memory, a sequence of impossibly complex, interlocking geometric symbols flashing for a mere nanosecond before vanishing. Maya's task was to recreate the final pattern from memory. To the audience, it was a blur of light and color. To Maya, it was language. Her mind, trained to catalog and cross-reference terabytes of archival data, did not see shapes. It saw relationships, symmetries, and repeating motifs. She parsed the sequence not as a single image, but as a sentence with its own syntax and grammar. She calmly used the touchscreen interface to replicate the pattern. A soft, green checkmark appeared on the screen. Correct. A polite, slightly surprised smattering of applause rippled through the ballroom. Finch, observing from a tall stool opposite her, a sleek tablet resting on his knee, offered a condescending half-smile. The introductory levels were designed to create a baseline, to give the illusion of a chance before the cognitive cliff face appeared. With each round, the complexity escalated not arithmetically, but exponentially. The box was an adaptive opponent, learning her strengths and weaknesses and recalibrating its attacks. It moved from visual memory to auditory recall, from spatial reasoning to abstract logic. Round 7, Harmonic Cascade, a synthesized, genderless voice announced from hidden speakers. A complex, multi-layered musical composition played, a cascade of atonal notes and shifting time signatures, accompanied by a hypnotic vortex of changing colors on the screen. The task was threefold. Replicate the primary melodic sequence in reverse. Identify the single microtonal frequency that was mathematically dissonant, and name the color palette that corresponded to the piece's final chord based on a set of synesthetic rules presented in round 3. It was designed to induce sensory overload, to short-circuit the brain's ability to multitask. Maya closed her eyes. She shut out the pressure of the hundreds of eyes on her, the weight of Finch's smug certainty. She let the noise wash over her, and then her mind began to do what it did best: translate. She converted the music into a waveform, a visual data stream. The melody became a series of peaks and valleys. The dissonant microtone was a single jagged spike in the otherwise fluid pattern. The synesthetic rules were a simple substitution cipher. It was a puzzle box, and she had spent her entire life taking puzzle boxes apart. She entered her answers. Correct. The applause this time was more robust, tinged with genuine astonishment. The whispers started to circulate. Who was this girl? Finch's smile was gone, replaced by a focused, faintly irritated line. This was taking longer than he'd anticipated. On his tablet, he subtly swiped a finger, manually increasing the difficulty algorithm by 20%. He was done waiting for the machine to break her. He would give it a helping hand. For the next hour, Maya was adrift in a sea of pure information. She navigated logic puzzles, wrapped in philosophical paradoxes. She deciphered historical codes embedded in ancient languages she didn't speak, using only contextual clues and grammatical patterns. She was no longer just playing the game. She was reverse engineering it, anticipating its moves, mapping its neural pathways. The atmosphere in the ballroom had transformed. The morbid curiosity had evaporated, replaced by the electric tension of a true gladiatorial contest. The spectacle of a poor girl's humiliation had been supplanted by the far more thrilling drama of a mysterious challenger holding a god of the universe at bay. Finch's irritation had now curdled into a cold, quiet anger. The Daedalus box was more than a machine. It was a reflection of his own intellect, vast, intricate, and utterly dominant. This girl, this no one, was not just solving his puzzles. She was violating the sanctity of his creation. She was walking through the halls of his mind and leaving her footprints. He had built in fail-safes, of course, psychological triggers. The game was about to get personal. Round 15. The panopticon, the voice intoned. The screen flickered, the abstract patterns dissolving. An image appeared that made Maya's blood run cold. It was a live, high-resolution satellite feed of her own apartment building in Queens. The image zoomed in, highlighting her window. Then it cut to a floor plan of the library branch where she worked. Then, a list of her most recently borrowed books, a financial statement from her student loan provider, a list of her mother's prescription medications. Finch was laying his cards on the table. I see everything. I know everything. You are not an opponent. You are a specimen under my microscope. Identify the anomaly, the synthesized voice commanded, as a rapid-fire slideshow of her life's data flashed before her. Her high school report card, her first credit card statement, a faded photograph of her parents, young and smiling. And then, it appeared for less than a second, but it was burned onto her retinas. A heavily redacted employee file from a chemical plant, Omnichem, which had been bought out and shut down 20 years ago. The plant where her father, Dr. Marcus Washington, had worked as a brilliant research chemist. Her father's death had been the defining tragedy of her life. A car accident on a rain-slicked road, the police had said. A single-vehicle incident. He had been laid off just weeks prior, a victim of the corporate restructuring after the buyout. The official story was clean, simple, and had never, not for a moment, felt true. The grief had left a vacuum in their lives, filled with unanswered questions that had hardened over the years into a quiet, painful certainty. Amidst the blur of information, Maya's trained eye caught it. An error. A single date in her father's digital file was formatted incorrectly. MM-DD-YYYY, while all others were DD-MM-YYYY. In the world of data integrity, this was not a typo. It was a liberate flag, a digital fingerprint left by a different user, a sign of alteration. It was a breadcrumb left in a forest of lies. Correct. Finch's jaw was tight. The personal assault, the display of his omnipotence, had been designed to shatter her composure, to flood her mind with emotion, and cripple her logic. But he had miscalculated. He had not accounted for the fact that Maya's emotional core was a fortress built over years of quiet grief and suspicion. He hadn't distracted her. He had given her a target. He leaned forward, his voice a low growl the microphone barely registered. Impressive data retrieval. But raw data is meaningless without context. Let's see how you handle a narrative. He was finished toying with her. He typed a rapid command into his tablet, initiating the box's final, unpublished Phase A protocol, so psychologically brutal, it was reserved for breaking corporate rivals during high-stakes negotiations. He called it the ego trap. But as the game morphed into its final, monstrous form, Maya's mind was bifurcating. One level was methodically disarming the ego trap, processing its cruel logic with an almost inhuman detachment. But a deeper, more urgent part of her brain was replaying that single, anomalous frame. Her father's file. The keychain in her clenched fist suddenly felt hot, its plastic shell seeming to thrum with a latent energy. The truth will set you free. Her mother's whisper. Her father's legacy. This wasn't a coincidence. Finch hadn't just plucked them from the crowd by chance. He knew who they were. This entire, elaborate public spectacle was not a random act of cruelty. It was a message. It was a display of dominance from a man so secure in his power that he could dangle the shredded remnants of her family's tragedy in front of her face, confident she could do nothing about it. It was a taunt. She needed a moment, a single beat to let the roaring in her head subside. During a 10-second system reset between the panopticon and the ego trap, Maya stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. "A glass of water, please?" Her voice was surprisingly steady. Finch, eager to appear the magnanimous host, gave a curt nod. As a waiter hurried forward, Maya walked to the edge of the stage, turning her back on the audience, as if to stretch. Her mother was a frantic shadow in the wings, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. Under the pretense of leaning on the proscenium for support, Maya intercepted her. She pressed the small, book-shaped keychain into Eleanor's hand. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a compressed spring of urgency. "This keychain. Dad gave it to you after he lost his job." "What did he say?" Exactly what did he say? Eleanor's eyes, wide with fear, sharpened with a 20-year-old memory. He was so scared, Maya. He said the world was run by monsters. He told me this little book was a key, but not for a lock. He said it held his nightingale. He said it was his life's work and his life insurance, all in one. Nightingale. The word struck Maya with the force of a physical impact. It wasn't a pet name or a poetic metaphor. It was a code name. It was the missing variable. "What is nightingale?" Maya pressed, her grip tightening on her mother's arm. Before Eleanor could answer, Finch's voice, sharp as broken glass, sliced across the stage. "Your hydration can wait, Miss Washington. We have a game to finish." Maya returned to her seat, the world tilting on its axis. The keychain. She'd held it 1,000 times. She knew its every cheap, molded detail. The seam around its edge. It wasn't a flaw from the plastic mold. It was too clean, too perfect. It was a seal. This wasn't a keychain. It was a vessel. A cleverly disguised flash drive. Her father hadn't left them a trinket. He had left them a witness. And Alistair Finch, in his infinite arrogance, had just put her on a global stage and told her exactly where to look. The game was no longer about winning $100 million. It was about finishing a war her father had started 2 decades ago. The smirk on Finch's face was no longer a symbol of his power. It was the epitaph of his hubris. The Daedalus box was not the real labyrinth. The real maze was the truth of the past, and Finch had just handed her the thread to navigate it. The ego trap was a descent into a bespoke hell. Alistair Finch, with the detached cruelty of a behavioral scientist, had designed the final levels to attack the very foundation of his opponent's identity. The screen no longer presented abstract puzzles, but hyper-realistic, interactive simulations, each one a moral and ethical minefield. The first simulation was a classic trolley problem, but with a sadistic twist. The figures tied to the tracks were not anonymous silhouettes. They were photorealistic avatars of people from Maya's life. Her mother on one track, her kindly, elderly neighbor on the other. A timer ticked down, forcing an impossible choice. Maya didn't choose. Instead, she analyzed the simulation's physics engine, found a flawed variable in the friction coefficient of the tracks, and entered a command that derailed the trolley harmlessly into a sandbank. A solution outside the intended binary. Logic error. Bypassing scenario. Finch stared at his monitor, a vein pulsing in his temple. She wasn't playing the game. She was hacking it. She wasn't wrestling with the morality. She was deconstructing the code. The next simulation was a market crash. A fictionalized version of the global economy was in free fall. And Maya was given control of the Federal Reserve. She had to make a series of impossible decisions, sacrificing pension funds to save hospitals or defunding education to stabilize the currency. The simulation was rigged. Every choice led to riots, poverty, and suffering. The goal was to induce a state of learned helplessness, to prove that even with ultimate power, the system was too complex, and failure was inevitable. Maya ignored the screaming headlines and plummeting graphs. She dove into the simulation's source code, visible only for a fraction of a second during a loading screen. She identified the root of the crash, a single, malicious algorithm designed to create a cascading failure. A ghost in the machine. A piece of code Finch himself had likely designed. She didn't play the game of saving the world. She isolated and deleted the malicious code. The market on the screen stabilized instantly. System anomaly detected. Proceeding to final round. Finch slammed his hand down on the console beside him. She was refusing to be broken. She was treating his masterpiece of psychological warfare like a corrupted file in need of repair. He stood up and began to pace the stage, the panther whose cage has been rattled. The audience was a living entity, its breath held in a collective lung, sensing that the game had transcended its own rules and was now a raw battle of wills. Final round. The Oracle's Dilemma, the voice announced, its synthesized calm a stark contrast to the tension on stage. Finch stopped pacing and turned to the audience, his voice a low, dangerous purr. This is my magnum opus, a predictive test. The box will present a complete data archive from a company on the brink of collapse, internal memos, financial reports, R&D logs, personnel files. The player will have 60 seconds to sift through the digital noise and predict the precise date, cause, and architect of the company's bankruptcy. He turned his burning gaze on Maya. The data is from a real-world case. A promising pharmaceutical firm called Avum Therapeutics. A tragic, classic case of mismanagement and bad luck went under 2 decades ago. A real shame. His eyes glittered with malicious intent. Let's see if your remarkable pattern recognition can solve a mystery from the real world. Avum Therapeutics. The name, spoken in this room by this man, was a detonation in the quiet archive of Maya's mind. It was the company from her father's file, the ghost that had haunted her family's dinner table for 20 years. A tidal wave of data flooded the screen. It was an ocean of information, intentionally corrupted and filled with red herrings. There were fabricated reports of failed clinical trials, falsified memos about an impending SEC investigation, carefully planted news articles about a competitor's miracle drug that was about to render Avum's entire pipeline obsolete. It was a masterclass in digital disinformation, designed to lead any analyst down a dozen wrong paths. But Maya wasn't looking at the noise. She was listening for the silence. The ghost. The thing that should be there, but wasn't. Her fingers flew across the interface, not reading the documents, but tracking their metadata. She sorted the entire archive by creation date, then cross-referenced it with access logs. She was looking for a shadow, a digital black hole, and she found it. A project folder, codenamed Nightingale. Its contents were almost entirely wiped, but its digital signature remained. The project lead, Dr. Marcus Washington. The last access date was the day before her father was fired. The user who had accessed and deleted the files was logged simply as root admin, but the IP address originated from a server farm in the Cayman Islands, a server farm Maya had seen before in the financial architecture of the market crash simulation. A server farm owned by a shell corporation that belonged to Alistair Finch. Using a data fragmentation recovery tool she had once designed for the library, she managed to resurrect a single, corrupted file from the Nightingale folder. It was the last page of a clinical trial summary. The words were scrambled, but the numbers were clear. A cellular regeneration compound, 98.7% success rate in repairing damaged neural tissue. It wasn't just a drug. It was a miracle. A cure for Alzheimer's, for paralysis, for a dozen incurable conditions. A drug worth not millions, but trillions. And it had vanished. At the same time, her parallel search algorithm flagged a series of high-value patent transfers, all occurring in the week after her father's death. The patents, including the one for the Nightingale compound, were sold for pennies on the dollar to a series of anonymous offshore entities. The firm that brokered these suspiciously rapid, undervalued sales was a young, aggressive private equity outfit that had come out of nowhere. Finch Acquisitions. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid shutting. Finch didn't just profit from Avum's collapse. He had engineered it. He'd bought the company, identified its single most valuable asset, and realized it was more profitable to bury the cure and sell the patent to a competitor who would also bury it to protect their own less effective but highly profitable long-term treatment drugs than to actually produce it. He hadn't just stripped the company for parts. He had suppressed a cure that could have saved millions of lives. Her father hadn't been laid off for being redundant. He had been eliminated for being a witness. He was the one man who understood the true value of Nightingale and had the integrity to fight for it. His accident was the final, brutal act of corporate redaction. The 60-second timer on the screen chimed, its soft beep and obscenity in the face of what she had discovered. Maya slowly lifted her head from the screen. She didn't look at Finch. She looked directly into the lens of the main broadcast camera, her face calm, her eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. She knew this feed was being watched by investors, by journalists, by the entire world that Finch had built around himself. Avum Therapeutics didn't go bankrupt due to mismanagement or a failed drug trial, she said, her voice amplified by the microphone, clear and steady and devastating. It was a targeted assassination. Its most valuable asset, a revolutionary cure for neurological damage, codenamed Nightingale, was deliberately suppressed. Finch went rigid, his face draining of color. The mask of the calm puppet master was gone, replaced by the snarling face of a cornered beast. That is a wild, unsubstantiated fantasy. Answer the question you were given, or you forfeit the game and the prize. Maya's gaze remained locked on the camera. The creator of that cure, the project lead, Dr. Marcus Washington, discovered the plan to bury his life's work. He was going to expose the scheme. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. He was eliminated in a staged car accident 1 week after being fired. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. This had metastasized from a corporate game into a true crime story, unfolding live on stage. The architect of the bankruptcy, Maya continued, finally turning to face the man who had haunted her life, was the same man who brokered the sale of the stolen patents. The same man who profited from a suppressed cure and a silenced scientist. She stood up, her small frame radiating an immense, unshakable power. Isn't that right, Mr. Finch? You didn't just predict the company's collapse. You were its architect. Security! Finch bellowed, his voice a ragged roar of fury and panic. Get this hysterical woman off my stage. The game is over. 2 large men in black suits started to move from the wings, but Maya held up her hand. I'm not finished. She looked back at the camera, at the unseen global audience. My father knew they would come for him. He knew he wouldn't survive, but he was a scientist. He believed in data. He believed the truth leaves a trail. He left behind the evidence. He left behind the key. As she spoke, her phone, which she had placed face down on the console, vibrated silently. It was a pre-arranged signal. The final move in a game Finch didn't even know he was playing. Hundreds of miles away, in a darkened server room, lit only by the green glow of cascading code, a figure known only as Silas saw the signal on his monitor. Silas was a ghost in the machine, a legendary white-hat hacker whose own career had been destroyed by Finch 2 decades ago when his revolutionary encryption software was stolen and weaponized by Finch acquisitions. Maya had found him on the deepest, most secure channels of the dark web, a desperate plea for help. He had been skeptical at first, but when she'd sent him the initial data from the keychain, he recognized the digital fingerprints of his old nemesis. For Silas, this was not just a job. It was a reckoning. With a final, decisive keystroke, Silas launched the payload. On the massive 8K resolution screen behind Alistair Finch, The logo of the Daedalus box wavered, glitched, and dissolved into static. And then, a new image resolved, crisp and damning. It was a scanned document, an internal Finch acquisitions memo dated 20 years ago. The author was Alistair Finch. The subject line read simply, "The Nightingale Problem." The body of the memo was one chilling sentence. The asset is too valuable to be public, and the asset's creator is too principled to be controlled. Liquidate the project and neutralize the creator. Plausible deniability is paramount. The screen flickered. Now, it showed a complex web of offshore bank transfers, a visual money trail leading from Finch Acquisitions to the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation, and then a 7-figure payment to a security consultant with known ties to organized crime, paid out the day after her father's death. Then, a final image. The fully restored Project Nightingale file. Not just the final page, but the entire, unredacted report, complete with video logs of the trials, paralyzed rats learning to walk again, brain-damaged primates showing full cognitive recovery. It was a portrait of a medical miracle, strangled in its crib. The ballroom was entombed in a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. Alistair Finch stared at the screen, his face a grotesque mask of shock and incandescent rage. He had built an empire on the principle of controlling information, of owning the narrative. Now, his own story was being told, his own secrets weaponized against him on his own stage. And then a new sound intruded, faint at first, then growing rapidly in pitch and intensity. A sound that cut through the sterile, controlled atmosphere of the tower. Sirens. Not the lone cry of a passing ambulance, but a chorus of them, a swarm of them, converging on the Finch Tower from every direction. The ornate double doors of the ballroom burst open. It wasn't hotel security. It was a dozen FBI agents, their dark suits and grim faces a stark intrusion of reality into the night's fantasy. They moved with the calm, inexorable purpose of men who already knew the outcome. The lead agent, a tall man with a weary but determined face, walked directly onto the stage, bypassing Maya as if she were a statue. He held up his badge and a warrant to the frozen, trembling form of Alistair Finch. Alistair Finch. The agent's voice was flat, clinical, and echoed through the silent room with the finality of a judge's gavel. You are under arrest for securities fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit the murder of Dr. Marcus Washington. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs snapping around Finch's wrists was the only sound. It was the sound of an unbreakable chain finally breaking. It was the sound of a ghost's 20-year whisper finally becoming a roar. It was the sound of a daughter's promise being kept. As the agents led him away, his billion-dollar suit now looking like a cheap costume, Finch's eyes found Maya's. The arrogant smirk, the cold contempt, the aura of untouchable power. It was all gone, stripped away to reveal the small, terrified man beneath. In his eyes, she saw it, for one fleeting, devastating moment. Regret. Not the noble regret of remorse, but the raw, pathetic regret of the master strategist who made one fatal miscalculation. He had wagered a fortune on a game of his own design, and, in his hubris, had failed to see the much larger game being played against him. He hadn't just lost $100 million. He had lost the world. The fall of Alistair Finch was not a quiet affair. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through Wall Street, Washington, and the global business community. The Nightingale Papers, as the media instantly dubbed the contents of the flash drive, were a Pandora's box of corporate malfeasance. The investigation spawned by the initial arrest grew into a sprawling, multi-agency task force that unearthed decades of Finch's crimes: insider trading, political corruption, corporate espionage, and the systematic destruction of dozens of companies and countless lives. His empire crumbled not like a building, but like a mountain in a landslide, a slow, thundering, and total collapse. The Finch Foundation was dissolved in disgrace, its name a permanent stain. The courts, in a landmark ruling, seized its remaining assets, billions of dollars, and placed them into a federally supervised trust. The trust's first and most celebrated act was to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into re-establishing a public, non-profit version of Avum Therapeutics. Its sole mission was to take Dr. Marcus Washington's resurrected research and finally bring Project Nightingale to the world. The cure he had died to protect would now become his legacy. In the midst of the legal and media maelstrom, the trust's new board formally offered Maya the $100 million prize. It was, they said, not a prize for winning a game, but a finder's fee for uncovering a truth that would save millions of lives. She met with them in a sterile boardroom that felt eerily similar to the one Finch must have occupied, and she politely but firmly refused the money. It would forever be tied to that night, to Finch's smirk, to the public humiliation of her mother. It was the fruit of a poisoned tree. Instead, she made a counter-proposal. She asked them to use a portion of the funds to establish the doctor, Marcus Washington Grant, for scientific integrity. It would be a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to providing legal protection, financial support, and a public platform for whistleblowers in the worlds of science and technology. Her father's name would be transformed from a victim's footnote into a shield for future truth-tellers. The board, humbled and eager for a positive headline, agreed immediately. The identity of Silas was never revealed. He remained a ghost. One final, encrypted message appeared on Maya's laptop late one night, before his digital trail vanished forever. He stole my past. You gave me a future worth building. Justice is a system. Sometimes it just needs a reboot. Be well, M. Months later, the noise had faded. The world, with its voracious appetite for scandal, had moved on. Alistair Finch was a cautionary tale, a name whispered in boardrooms, his face relegated to grainy archive footage. For Maya and Eleanor, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But it was a new kind of normal, one defined not by the presence of grief, but by the absence of a shadow. They still lived in the same apartment in Queens, the one Finch had so casually displayed to the world. They had refused the offers of penthouses and safe houses, choosing to remain in the place that was theirs. One cool autumn evening, Maya stood with her mother on their small balcony, looking out at the distant, glittering skyline of Manhattan. The Finch Tower was still there, a dark monolith against the twilight, but it no longer seemed menacing. It was just a building. Its power had been an illusion, and they had broken the spell. Eleanor, who had finally retired, her hands no longer aching from the weight of other people's luxury, put her arm around her daughter. For months, she had watched Maya navigate the storm with a strength that had left her in awe. I used to look at those lights, Eleanor said, her voice soft. And I felt so small, so invisible. I felt like we were just down here, and they were up there, and that was the way the world worked. She squeezed Maya's shoulder. You showed me that the world works the way brave people make it work. Maya leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of home. She thought of her father, not with the sharp pain of loss that had accompanied his memory for 2 decades, but with a warm, quiet pride. He had planted a seed of truth in the dark, hoping that one day someone would find it and give it light. She looked out at the sprawling, complex city, that intricate system of power and money, of secrets and lies. She had always seen it as an archive, a place of buried stories. And she knew, with a librarian's quiet certainty, that no matter how deep a truth is buried, no matter how powerful the man who buries it, it is never truly gone. It waits patiently in the silence, in the data, in the ghost in the machine, for the right person to come along and have the courage to read it aloud. Faith, she had learned, was not about believing the world was just. It was about knowing that truth, given a voice, was the most powerful force within it. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence in her own heart felt like peace.